One of the great, great, great privileges we have as Christians is making a difference in this world for Jesus Christ. No matter what God has called you to do, no matter what your occupation is, you are called literally to be an ambassador for Christ. You are called to make a difference for Christ. See, we are to take the good news, the gospel, to the ends of the world. But literally, we are to take the gospel to our personal world. And every one of us in this auditorium have a different world, have a different set of friends, acquaintances, places we go. And literally, each and every one of us are to take the gospel. We are to be a missionary. We are to be an ambassador for Jesus Christ. One of the requirements, one of the necessities for being what God would have us to be in this world is standing for truth, is standing for godliness, is standing for righteousness. Now, the tendency so many times, well, we just want to be like everybody else. We just want to go along and get along. But the fact is, as we live in a wicked world that's getting more wicked by the day, we need some young people. We need some children. We need some college students. We need some parents. We need some senior adults that will stand up and that will say, you know what? God has called me to be different. God has called me to stand up for what is true. God has called me to stand up for what His Word says is right. And He has called all of us to do that. We come to Daniel chapter 3. Daniel chapter 3 is really 30 years, Bible scholars tell us, before we come to Daniel chapter 4, what's recorded there. Daniel chapter 3 very literally is about 3 young men that we've heard of since we were children that stood for right, that didn't just go along with the crowd, that stood up and said, you know what? God has called us to be different. God has called us to stand up for truth, for righteousness, for godliness. And if no one joins us, we're going to stand for truth. We're going to stand for what God says is right. If we have to suffer consequences, we will. But we will die before we will compromise. In a world of compromise, in a world where everything is, oh, well, don't be too fanatical. It's refreshing to see young people that say, God, I want to please you more than I want to please man. God, I want to stand for truth if no one stands for truth. Studdard Kennedy was a military chaplain in World War II. Military chaplains in that day, they had a very dangerous job. They were on the front lines, but yet when fired upon, they could not fire back because they were chaplains. In the midst of a great battle, he came aside, the fighting had subsided there momentarily, and he sat down, having just gone through this great battle, and he wrote his son a letter. His son was 10 years old. This is what he said. The first prayer I want you to pray for me is not, God, keep Daddy safe. The first prayer I want you to pray for me is, God, make Daddy brave. And if he has hard things to do, make him strong so that he can do them. Son, life and death don't matter, but right and wrong do matter. Daddy dead is Daddy still. But Daddy dishonored before God is something too awful for words. We come to Daniel chapter 3. We see 3 men who just stood up for right, who said, we rather die than be known as dishonoring our God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were strangers in a strange land. They show us the importance of doing what's right. They were taken captive from their country to Babylon in 605 BC. They lived in a pagan country. They lived far, far from home. But even though they were away from the church, And even though they were away from their parents, and even though they were away from life as they knew it, their Christian lives, they still stood for right. The sermon is entitled, Trial by Fire. The first characteristic of these young people I want you to notice is the stand of these Hebrews. Notice verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 80 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Now Nebuchadnezzar was a mighty king. Bible scholars tell us he was one of the greatest kings of history, and he was definitely one of the most powerful kings at this time period. Nebuchadnezzar was a great builder. Nebuchadnezzar built the great hanging gardens of Babylon, which were one of the wonders of the world at this time. As great as those gardens were, those gardens did not compare to his greatest construction achievement, which was this golden image. It was the crowning jewel of his building. The plain of Dura, where this was out far away so people could see this golden image and reverence Nebuchadnezzar from far away. It was 16 miles south of Babylon, and this was kind of normal in this day. It was nothing unusual for kings to erect images for their constituents to worship them. When the statue was completed, they had a great celebration. Now notice verse 2. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather together the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the princes, the governors and captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together unto the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So they have this magnificent dedication. All the dignitaries are there. All of the big shots are there. They have all been invited to attend this ceremony. Royal invitations had been sent out, and no one that was supposed to be there, they were not going to miss this celebration. The political leaders were there. The military leaders were there. The judicial leaders were there. The financial leaders were there. They came from every province of Babylon. It was a grand day. It was a glorious day. It would be like our presidential inauguration with all of the festivities and all of the pomp. Notice verse 4. Then an herald cried aloud, "To you it is commanded, O people, nations, and language, at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, the dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth, shall the same hour be cast in the midst of a burning fiery furnace." So they have this great orchestra with every instrument that they had at this time. The act of worship was mandatory. The penalty for not bowing down would be your life. This was not just, showing reverence. You were recognizing that this was the true God. Notice verse 7. Therefore, at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations, the languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. So the moment came. The band struck up the music, and everyone was to bow down. This was a magnificent dedication. Secondly, it was, notice, their marvelous devotion. The moment came, they struck up the band, everyone bowed down. Well, almost everyone bowed down. Notice verse 8. Wherefore at that time certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. They spake and said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. Thou, O king, hast made a decree that every man shall hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth, that he should be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. More than likely, out of jealousy, these Chaldeans come and tell Nebuchadnezzar that these 3 Hebrews, these 3 young people that you have exalted, are not following your commands. Now, why didn't they just bow down? Why didn't these young people just go along? Why did they have to stand up when everyone bowed down? Exodus chapter 20, verse 3. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. And thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the 3rd and 4th generation of them that hate me. To bow down to the image of Nebuchadnezzar would have been a violation of God's command. Their devotion to God would not allow them to bow down. Their devotion to God said, hey, we may burn, and if need be, we will. But we cannot bow down to a false god. Now, they could have easily compromised. They could have easily rationalized bowing down to that idol. They could have said, well, we'll bow down on the outside, but on the inside we'll be standing up straight. They could have said, well, when in Babylon, do as the Babylonians. We're just going along with the crowd so that we can make a difference to them. But no, they didn't do that. These men had rather burn than desecrate the name of their God. They had rather defy the law of the land than to despise the Lord of Lords. Their devotion, the stand of the Hebrews. Secondly, I want you to notice the steadfastness of the Hebrews. Notice verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, and commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spake and said unto them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? He said, is it true? Is what I hear true? Do you not understand the consequences? Everyone bowed down. You were the only 3. Tell me, is this true? Notice verse 15. Even though he's angry, he gives them a second chance. Now, if ye be ready, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the image which I have made, well. But if ye worship not, ye shall be cast the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Now notice the last phrase. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Now wait a minute. Up until this moment, this was a conflict between 3 Hebrews and the king. But with that last phrase, Nebuchadnezzar brings God into it and says, hey boys, who is your God that he can deliver you from me? Little did Nebuchadnezzar know who he was dealing with. Can you imagine the pressure to conform? Can you imagine the tremendous pressure just to go along with the crowd? Hey guys, if you ever want to witness to these people, if you ever want to bring them along, just bow down. You can live to witness later on. But they were steadfast. Nebuchadnezzar gives them a second chance to reconsider what they had done. Notice their response. Their decision was unchangeable. Notice verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. That little phrase, we are not careful, it is not necessary for us to answer you in this matter. King, it's not necessary that we go and think about this. It's not necessary that we go home and reconsider our decision. Our decision, O King, is unchangeable. Our decision, we believe, was right. And King, while we honor your position, we have to honor our God, and we must stand for right. That's separation. Separation? Who talks about separation anymore? Who talks about standing and being devoted for Christ? Listen, no matter what our society says, the Bible is still true, and we should still be separated. We should still be consecrated to the Lord. Their decision was unchangeable. Secondly, their devotion was unshakable. Notice verse 17. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thy hand, O King. You see, they were devoted to God, and the decision that they made not to bow down was because of their devotion. They said, hey, throw us into the fiery furnace. God'll deliver us. We believe in our God, and he is able to deliver us, and he will. Their devotion was unshakable. Thirdly, their determination was unwavering. Notice verse 18. But if not, be it known unto thee, O King, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. They said, hey, we believe our God will deliver us, and we believe our God can deliver us. But if not, we're still going to serve him. But if not, it's the greatest kind of faith in all the world, where we stand up and we say, we serve an almighty God, and he can and he will deliver us. But if not, as Job said, though he slay me, yet will I serve him. The but if not faith. The time for talk is over, King. We're ready to burn, but we won't bow down. We're ready to burn, but we won't bend. We're ready to burn, but King, respectfully, we cannot budge, because our King of Kings is Lord, and we cannot defy his name. It's one thing to have faith to escape the furnace. It's something entirely different to have faith to endure the furnace. And they were ready to burn for Christ. Now I'm talking to some adults, talking to some college students, some teenagers. I'm not asking you to burn for your faith. I'm asking you to live for Christ. You know what? We live in a society, they're not going to kill you for standing up for Christ. And yet so many Christians, they want to hang out with the world. They want to get involved in things that aren't right. They want to get involved in things that are not godly, that are not pleasing to the Lord. And there may come a time where you may have to die for your faith, but it's not now, not in America. Then why don't we live for Christ? We see their devotion. These young men, they were not being stubborn against the king. You find nowhere where they were rebellious. They were very respectful. They just stood for righteousness. Oh, for some young people. Oh, for some dads. Oh, for some moms who would say, hey, I don't know what other parents are doing. I don't know what other young people are doing. I don't know what other teenagers are doing. But I'm going to serve the Lord. I'm going to be committed to his word. I'm going to be a person who gets up every morning just to read God's word and spend time with him. I'm going to stand for truth, the steadfastness of these Hebrews. Thirdly, I want you to notice the sentence of these Hebrews. Verse 19. Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Therefore he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was wont to be heated. Verse 20. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, and their hats, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Now, this never happened. Usually they were stripped of their clothes, but there was such anxiousness. They wanted to get them in the furnace. They bound them like they were. Notice verse 22. The results just of the temperature. Therefore, because of the king's commandment was urgent and the furnace exceeding hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The furnace was so hot that the most mighty men died when they threw them into the furnace. You say, why were the Hebrews not killed at that point? Because God was protecting them. Listen, when you stand for God, when you stand alone for God, He protects you. It didn't matter how hot it was to the Hebrews. God was their protection. Notice verse 23. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished. We get our word astonished. He sees the dead men of his strongest soldiers lying there, and he sees these three Hebrews in the fire walking around praising God. Can you see these guys with their hands in the air saying, oh, it's wonderful to be a Christian. Oh, it's wonderful to be God's child. Oh, it's wonderful to have your sins forgiven. They were praising God. And Nebuchadnezzar's looking at his three dead men, and he's astonished. Wait a minute. He's astonished at something else. Notice verse 24. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, and rose up in haste and spake and said to his counselors, did not we cast three men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, true, O king. And he said, lo, I see four men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt. And the form of the fourth is like the Son of God. Not only were they walking around loose, they had picked up a visitor. It was Jesus. Jesus came and went with them in the fire. You say, why was Jesus in the fire with them? Because He has promised every one of us, I will never leave thee and I will never forsake thee. And when you're thrown into the fiery furnace for your faith, Jesus will be there with you. Jesus will be there with you, encouraging you. Jesus will be with you. You'll never be in the fire alone. Notice verse 26. Then Nebuchadnezzar came forth to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God. Now wait a minute. He would have never recognized them as servants of God if they had not stood up for what was right. And the same is true with every person in this auditorium. The world will never recognize you as being a servant of God unless you stand up for what is right. Look on in the verse. Come forth hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth of the midst of the fire. And the princes, governors, and captains, and the king's counselors being gathered together, saw these men. Now they had seen these young men before, but they saw them differently. They saw them having God's protection, having God's hand upon their lives. And the world, when you stand up for righteousness, they'll see you differently. Yeah, you may have to go through the fire. Yeah, you may have to go through the furnace. But when you come out, the world will recognize you. There's something different about that person. Look on. Upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was an hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed upon them. If they had not stood up for God, they would have not been thrown into that fiery furnace. But if they had not been thrown into that fiery furnace, they would have never experienced the presence of God. If they had not been thrown into that fiery furnace, they would never have experienced the protection of God. If they had not been thrown into that fiery furnace, they would have never experienced the power of God. And it's all because they stood up for right. Very quickly, notice not only the sentence of these Hebrews, notice the success of these Hebrews. First of all, verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar's devotion. Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Do you see what he said? These young people have changed the decree of the king. This never happened. If you challenged the decree of the king, you were killed because they stood for right. They changed the king. Nebuchadnezzar's devotion. Secondly, notice Nebuchadnezzar's decree, verse 29. Therefore I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver them after this sort. He says, their God is the right God, and we will worship their God. Notice thirdly, Nebuchadnezzar's declaration. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Because these young men obeyed God, they went from the furnace to the palace. They went to a higher position than they held because they stood for God. Now I'm talking to fathers. I'm talking to mothers. I'm talking to young people. I'm talking to teenagers. The way you're promoted in life is by standing for right. You see, it's God that promotes. We can't climb the corporate ladder. It's God that puts people up and God that puts people down. The way you move up in life is by standing for right. Standing alone brings the protection of God. Standing alone brings the presence of God. Standing alone brings the promotion of God. Are you standing for right? So many times we're tempted in this world just to compromise. You know, it's not so bad. It's not that evil. It's not that wicked. Well, everybody's doing it. Come on, let's just go along. Oh, for some dads that would stand up and say, hey, I can't say what all the other husbands are doing, but I want to be a pure father. Hey, I can't say what all the other dads are doing, but I want to be a dad that loves my children and leads them as a spiritual leader. Hey, I can't say for some teenagers what everyone else is doing, but oh, for some teenagers that would stand up and say, God, I want to serve you. If no one else at school is serving you, if no one else wants to be an out-and-out Christian, then I will. Oh, for some college students that would just stand up and say, you know what? I may be nothing in life, but I'd rather be nothing in life standing for Jesus than to be something in life not standing for Jesus. One of the great martyrs of our faith was the man by the name of Athanasius, who lived around 300 A.D. He stood very courageously against Arianism. The emperor brought in Athanasius and said, Athanasius, you must stop being so militant for what you believe is right. He put pressure on him and said, hey, Athanasius, you just need to go along. Athanasius stood and very respectfully said, Emperor, I must stand for what God's word teaches. I cannot compromise. The emperor got very angry. The emperor's visage was changed as Nebuchadnezzar's was. And he says, Athanasius, the whole world is against you. Athanasius stood up bravely and says, Emperor, then I'm against the whole world. And oh, for some young people, oh, for some adults who would just stand up for right.